Hello and welcome to our coding snapshot on fractures. Get out your I10CM code book and let's go ahead and get started. There are two types of fractures, traumatic and pathological. If you're coding traumatic fractures, you want to go to the Chapter 19 Pacific Coding Guidelines, which covers injury, poisoning, and external causes. And this code range is S00 through 288. Traumatic fractures are acute in nature. They're a current injury. An example of a traumatic fracture would be if a patient was involved in a motor vehicle accident and they fractured their arm or the leg, or maybe the patient was working at a work site or at their home and they sustained a fall and sustained an injury or a fracture. Then there's a pathological fracture. These are caused by disease, and when you're coding pathological fractures, you want to go to Chapter 13, Disease of the Musculoskeletal System and Connective Tissue, and this code range is M00 through M99. Examples of pathological fractures caused by disease would be neoplasm, or when the bones become brittle, osteoporosis. When you're coding, keep these things in mind, and these are pulled right from the Chapter 19 coding guidelines. A fracture is either closed or open. A closed fracture means that there is no open wound. The physician might refer to this as a simple, green stick, or a depressed fracture. The open fracture is an open wound, or you may actually see the bone protruding through the skin, and the physicians will often document this type of fracture as a compound fracture, puncture, or missile fracture. Chapter 19 Coding Guidelines 2C states that a fracture not indicated as open or closed should be coded to close. A fracture not indicated whether displaced or not displaced should be coded to displace. A displaced fracture would mean that the bone cracked and pieces are separated. So in other words, the bone breaks and moves so the two ends are not lined up. A non-displaced fracture means there's a partial change to the bone or damage to the bone, and it's limited to a crack. Let's look at this coding snapshot, and let's code this one together. We have a patient that sustains a lateral malleus of the left fibula 6 weeks previously and is admitted for removal of pins under anesthesia. So in your coding fractures, ask yourself these questions. Is this a pathological or traumatic fracture? Where is the fracture site? What is the laterality? Laterality with fractures is right or left. And which seventh character is assigned? Let's look at this more closely on the next slide. So I've got here highlighted where the fracture occurred on the fibula. Specifically, the lateral malleus is where it occurred. So let's run through our questions. Is this a pathological or traumatic fracture? There's no sign of disease here in this example, so this would be considered a traumatic fracture. The fracture site is the fibula. The laterality here is left, and our seventh character here is going to be D. So let's go to our alphabetical index in I10CM, and let's go to our main term, fracture and traumatic. Fracture and traumatic. Now we have to go to the site of the fracture, fibula. Then we see these terms in parentheses, shaft and styloid. And we know that terms in parentheses are considered non-essential modifiers, and they're not going to impact the code. We see here S82.40 with a dash and a check, which indicates to us we're going to have to add additional characters once we get to the tabular list. Well, the physician told us exactly where on the fibula that the break occurred, so we want to drill down further, and we see the indented term lateral malleus, displace, S82.6 dash. So this is where we want to go. So we want to go to the tabular list to check this code out further. When we get to the tabular, what you're going to see here with S82.6, you'll see to the left of that code, it'll say check fifth character, fracture of lateral malleus. Then when we scroll down further, what we see is a check and an X and a seventh. That indicates to us that this fracture code is going to require 7 characters. So S82.62 is displaced fracture of the lateral malleus of the left fibula. To get to that 7th character, we want to flip all the way back to category S82, and what you'll see is the 7th character box. And we're going to select character D, which is subsequent encounter for a closed fracture with routine healing, because this patient sustained this fracture previously, and they're now being admitted for removal of those pins. So our correct code is S82.62X10. I hope you have found this coding snapshot on fractures helpful.